So in episode 4, we talked about sci-fi stories, but today I am thinking fairy tales. So if I was gonna write a fantasy script for my next film, I wonder where I would go. What elements do we expect when we go and watch a fantasy film? By the way, expectation is a form of fantasy. All right, so the definition of fantasy: the faculty or activity of imagining things, especially things that are impossible or improbable. Impossible or improbable, kind of like translating Egyptian text with a peep stone out of a hat, baptisms for the dead, getting your own planet. Tell you what, thinking a world of 7.5 billion people should think the same way that 0.02% of the population thinks? Yeah, so I think we have fantasy figured out. I think we get a good hold on what that means. Think about some of the early Disney films like Snow White, Cinderella, Sleeping Beauty. These are all films that kind of gave us an all-American basis for fantasy, right? So let's start with our main character. She's young, she's special, she's interesting, but no one really appreciates her true inner talent except for that prince. But the prince is often some foreign land, conquering indigenous peoples, teaching them his language and his religion, his culture. Because of course they don't have a culture of their own. The prince returns to his kingdom and he tells the people of his adventures and how he brought light to the dark people. Then one night when the prince goes to the ball, he sees the woman across the way and he runs to her and they fall in love. And they run off to be married in that castle of 1,000 mirrors. Then they ride off to the sunset and they build that world of perfection. So what happens to us when we binge watch fantasy films from an early age? No, really, I'm curious, what happens to us? What does that do to our heads? What happens to our expectations later in life when reality sets in? Because they never really show Cinderella after the end. They just lived happily ever after. But what does that look like? Because that's kind of the hard part, right? The beginning's all fun and games, but the ending, we need that part. I mean, was the prince sexist? Was he patriarchal? Overbearing? I mean, does he keep her in the kitchen making pie all the time? What does happily ever after look like? What happens when it turns out we're not really as special as we were told all those years, right? And what happens when Cinderella or Prince Charming don't really live up to the expectations they were given? Imperfection. Perfection is fantasy. Something isn't working. Okay, so now I'm gonna have to delve back into my childhood to add some things from my own personal life into the story that we have going here. When I was a kid, 10 years old, my mom and I had joined the church 2 years before, and she was a single woman in a Mormon church. So she would take me with her to the Mormon singles activities. Yeah, fun. I remember sitting on the stage of the cultural hall after a Mormon singles fireside, and I would watch all of these single people start to mix and mingle around the punch bowl. Punch bowl needed a little alcohol, by the way. Within a few minutes, the people in this group would start to gather into small little atoms. Got a nucleus with two really good-looking people who are flirting with each other. Then they got their sidekick. They weren't quite as attractive. And then you had a third ring around them of people who were just kind of lame ducks. These are people who were really not too attractive, maybe a little weird. And they would kind of wander from one group to another and see kind of if they could fit in. Never happened. And then there's those who think you can take one odd duck and another odd duck and pair them together. But the problem is, most odd ducks are not attracted to other odd ducks. It's not that nice and neat. This crazy little ensemble of singles had a name. The church gave it. It was Young Special Interests, right? What does that mean? And since that name wasn't very flattering, they just went by YSI. That was the way to put it. YSI, I'm going to YSI. Now you gotta remember, YSI was a group of people who had either been never married or they were divorced. So in either way, they didn't fit into the norm because according to the fantasy, you have to pair off, get married in the castle, then start a family and work your way up to the kingdom. And these people didn't really fit in that world over here, so they were given their own special room where they could try to pair up and see if they could make this over here work from over here. Awkward at best. Tangent question, does anyone know of a bishop or a stake president who were ever divorced? I don't think I've ever seen that. Anyway, back to the circle of young special interests. It's very possible that I, as a 10-year-old boy, was watching a group of misfits trying to regulate themselves socially, physically, sexually, to streamline themselves into this fiction that was given to them to fulfill. But this was the mid-70s, where you had the men were macho and the women were coy, and then, where were the old maids? I always wondered that. The girls who just didn't quite really fit in. Where were the gay and lesbian people? They had to have been around. And it seemed kind of strange to me that among all of these bad polyester outfits and weird comb-over hairdos, that anyone would be left out, that anyone would be too weird to be accepted by this group of people. They were all misfits. They were all different. And that was okay. But it wasn't okay. Speaking of the LGBTQ community, what does the word forever mean to them in the 70s in the Mormon church? That's gotta be a rough road right there. Anyway, if you fast forward to the year 2000, I became that divorced Mormon. The fantasy was over. Wait, we did everything right. According to the storybook, the plan was fallible. We were fallible. We were human. We weren't perfect, because perfect is fantasy. I guess I wasn't the prince after all. Getting married in that big castle where my never Mormon family couldn't come and see me get married? Not worth it at all. But let's skip that part and get to the good part. What happens when the fairy tale falls apart? I remember shortly after going back to church without my family. Everything the church had promoted so far, when it came to forever family, was now null and void. I remember sitting in sacrament meeting among the other forever families who were still intact, thinking, what the fuck? What do I do now? Here I was hanging around with Mormons who didn't really understand how you talk to someone who was no longer on the plan, someone who was now divorced. How do you talk to the divorced guy? We don't know. And so when we'd have these conversations at church, it was really awkward. It was kind of like they had the tone of, can I go now? And then almost immediately, the bishop said, here's a little map. It'll help you get right to where you need to be. A special group called Special Interests. All I could think was, oh no. I've become my mother. And not my mother now, but my mother, 20 years before when she was single and in that same group. And then the worst thought came to me, and that was, am I going to be that odd duck in that group of singles? But I'm the kind of guy who has to try to figure things out, and I don't really like to leave a stone unturned. I'll try anything, alcohol, cocaine, old Mormon dances. So there I was one Saturday night, sitting at a Mormon dance for singles. Just like when I was 10 years old, there I was, sitting on the stage. And I played a little thought game with my head where you tell yourself things that aren't really true, like, I like it here, I'm having a good time. This is great music, I love it, it's fun. Then it happened. Not one, but two women approached me. I could see them coming from about 30 yards away. They ended up coming over, jumping up on the stage, sitting on either side of me, and they decided to start, small talk. And let me start by saying this, they were really nice people, I'm not putting them down. It was just a weird situation for everyone involved. We can all sit back and laugh about how that used to be, but at the time, it wasn't funny. It was almost like they brought their own dating app with them, and they were sitting there asking questions. Ding, check, ding, check. Ding, check. Not natural at all. And then at one point, one of the women decided that she was going to leave me to the other woman, and she left. That made it even more awkward because now it's not a party. Now this has to work. So I'm going to take a painfully long story and cut it shorter. Let's fast forward to the spot where I'm walking very fast from the dance to my car, and the girl who was sitting next to me on the stage is running after me. It was a little bit like Cinderella, except I didn't have on any glass slippers. There I was trying to get to my carriage before it turned into a pumpkin. And the sad part about the whole thing is that we all had that look in our eye, and that was, the fantasy is over. And I think we all know how this fantasy is going to end, because you can't force happily ever after. Just because you sit and read it in a storybook over and over from the time you're a child till the time you're an adult, it doesn't mean it's true, it doesn't mean it's going to happen. And that's why it's called a fantasy. Fantasy, meet confirmation bias.